welcome to session 3. Really happy to have you all here. Just a quick intro, like Glenda said, I'm a community educator with a passion for scholastic mischief. We're going to talk about this photograph, but in this photograph are two of my favorite people in the entire world, Beyonce and this young man right here. And he is actually part of the reason why I founded With Reverence Co-op as a way to kind of make history more accessible to folks and be able to connect the past to today. So as always, I like to start with ground rules. This is a no knowledge shaming space. I'm not interested in making you feel bad for what you don't know. We all were not taught history, in the most unbiased or accurate way. Questions are highly encouraged. My mom always says that she doesn't have a monopoly of knowledge and nobody else does. So I may not know the answer, but I do love going on scavenger hunts for the answer. So please ask questions as they come to you. And you, again, like Lynn said, you don't need any familiarity of this topic before. Like I'm going to walk you through what we're going to do today. Okay, so our path today, I'm going to do a recap of session 1 and 2. And then I just want to note that today we'll have definitely a much more personal touch to the information as a way to help understand that like the time gaps are not as big as we think they are. We're going to talk about the complicated path to desegregating access to healthcare, which is going to include the civil rights movement and particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Then we're going to look at how the community worked with medical professionals to fill in some of those healthcare gaps that were still present. And to kind of wrap up these first 3 sessions, you're a Jedi. Or for my Harry Potter watchers, you're a wizard, Harry. You are one of the most important pieces in making all of this work. So we're going to talk about that and then give you guys some details around session 4 and ask some questions. Okay. The photographs you're looking at are really important. So the top one is Dr. Mamie Clark and her husband, Dr. Kenneth Clark. I really love putting the wife first because it just, I was raised by a single mom, so maybe that's why. 2, I love this picture because I love how he looks at her, right? With this sort of like reverence, love, and all that. And they're going to be very important to our story. And then at the bottom, you're looking at a photograph from sickle cell anemia testing. So those 2 things are going to come into play as we start our journey. Okay, so we're going to recap the first 2 sessions. I love color-coded things, even though I'm wearing all black, but just know I love color-coded things. So we're going to start with the recap of session 1. So we started session 1 in 1845, and we were talking about 3 enslaved women, Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy, who were given to a man named J. Merriam Sims, essentially to experiment on. J. Merriam Sims ended up receiving the kind of moniker of father of modern gynecology because of the experiments that he did on these women. And essentially the experiments were trying to figure out how to resolve the tears that happen when somebody gives birth. Those experiments led to him kind of creating the first initial versions of the speculum. That's a photograph, a pretty famous painting of Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy, and the gentleman in the full coat is Sims. Then we get to 1847, and we have the founding of the American Medical Association, which as a medical firm is very important to y'all. Now, we get to the 1860s, and it's bananas in pajamas, right? So we have Dr. Rebecca Crumpler, who becomes the first Black lady doctor in 1864. And right after that, we get the founding of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is really important because at this point, we're in the middle of the Civil War, right? Like we're at the height of it. 1863, Lincoln has already signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And right before the end of the Civil War in March, we get the founding of something called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau essentially was the government trying to figure out what to do with the 4.4 million Black folks who were legally enslaved and now are not legally enslaved. And so that means healthcare, education, housing, all of that has to be figured out. And that's what the Freedmen's Bureau does. And within the Freedmen's Bureau, there was also healthcare, right? And so Dr. Crumpler was a doctor in the Freedmen's Bureau hospitals. And she realized that the Bureau being underfunded and understaffed, Black folks were not going to get access to good healthcare anyway. So she wrote a book called A Book on Medical Discourses in 2 parts, essentially giving instructions to Black folks and poor folks in general on ways that they can take care of themselves when they don't have access to healthcare. Sims becomes president of the AMA in 1876 and then goes on to write a really prominent book at that time on the history of anesthesia, which is crazy because he did not offer Betsy, Anarcha, Lucy, or the other women that he did those experiments on any anesthesia, even though it was available. So in that first session, we kind of established where this idea that pain tolerance for Black women and lack of consent for Black women is sort of established, right? We see the tendrils of it, the seeds of it kind of grow during this time with Jane Mariam Sims. We also see how formerly enslaved people are not able to get access to healthcare, adequate healthcare, and what they did in response to that, guided by medical professionals such as Dr. Crumpler. So in our second session, we started with the eugenics movement and looking at studies like Dr. Henry Goddard's Kallikak family, which essentially was a family tree that showed what happens when you have a child with somebody who is deemed feeble-minded. And that really kicked the eugenics movement into high gear, where they started having things like fitter family fairs. And the eugenics movement was really started by Francis Dalton, who happened to be the cousin of Charles Darwin. So this whole idea of like breeding and things of that nature comes from that sphere. And these negative perspectives on who is able to have children and who isn't, who's desirable or not, lent way to the 1924 Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. So this is a photograph of some of those fitter family fairs where you would literally come to be judged and see if your family is fit enough to kind of fit into this Aryan box that they have. And then this image is one of a pamphlet from Florida where they're talking about what it means to be feeble-minded and what you can and cannot do as a feeble-minded parent, quote unquote, right? So now these guys, the Daltons of the world, are trying to figure out how do we codify this into law, right? And that's where we get the 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck was a young lady who was assaulted by the son of the people that she worked for, and that resulted in a child, a little girl named Vivian. Unfortunately, the state of Virginia wanted to see if they could figure out how to deem her feeble-minded, which they did, and that caused her to be sterilized. And so from there, she was institutionalized, and we got the beginnings of legal sterilization that took place all across the country. This is a photograph of Carrie and her mother, Emma, who was also deemed feeble-minded at that time. We go to 1932, and this is where we entered the Tuskegee syphilis study. So Dr. Clark, who was the director of the Venereal Disease Division, was looking through his documents and his data and realized that there's a high number of syphilis cases in the American South. And so he approves this study to kind of watch how syphilis progresses in someone's body when it's not treated. Overall, 600 Black men in Tuskegee, Alabama were part of the study, and they never knew. They were just kind of told they had bad blood, right? Now, again, photograph of these men essentially getting their blood tested and not realizing that they're not getting treatment, even though they're being told that they're being treated for bad blood. Next, in 1935, we talked about another case of sterilization with Annie Cooper Hewitt. Her father was a very, very rich man, and he had left, a good portion of his estate to her. Her mother, Marnie, was not feeling that, and so she conspired with the doctors to deem her feeble-minded and sterilized her. Now, she did take her mom to court, but they couldn't reverse the sterilization, so it just kind of put this thing on the map. And what this case showed is it didn't matter if you were rich or white, you were still, at risk for being sterilized because the system is, built against you. The Tuskegee study was only supposed to last 4 to 6 months, but it ended up lasting almost 40 years. And the reason that, it even got blown up is because a former Tuskegee syphilis patient went to a different state. And when he went to the doctors in that different state, the doctor was like, oh, you have syphilis, we need to give you penicillin. And that doctor got reprimanded. And so that ended up getting to the ears of Peter Buxton, and he talked to a friend of his who was in the AP, and that is how this story kind of blew up. So this is where we stopped in our first 2 sessions, right? Like this kind of helps us understand how it's a slippery slope, and also a lot of these medical moments we are not taught. They're not common knowledge for a lot of us, right? Now, we are leaving, we're gonna like get back in the time machine, and we're gonna go back to the early 1900s. So we had the closing of the Freedmen's hospitals because the government was not trying to fund these hospitals because they didn't think that they were necessary, even though we knew that there was disparities in access to healthcare, right? So you have folks like this public health nurse who would go out into the rural areas and try and offer care as much as possible. But a lot of the times the wards look like this photograph over here, my right. over here, right, where it's like it's crowded, you know that it's underfunded, you know that folks are not getting quality of care, and it's very, very much so understaffed, right? So now we're getting out of the time of the freedmen's, right? So we've gone through Reconstruction, and now we are in the period of Jim Crow. So I spoke about Dr. Mamie Clark and Dr. Kenneth Clark. Now, what's most important about them is, first, I don't know if I can say this right, they are bad, awesome people, okay? They are the first African Americans to graduate from Columbia with their doctorates. Both of them in their own right are excellent. And for 14 years, they did a study called the doll test. And essentially what they did with the doll study is they would put two dolls that are exactly the same and have the young Black kids between the ages of 3 and 7 point at which doll is the good doll and which doll is the bad doll. And from these experiments, they started to understand the psychological effects of segregation on children, right? This is children. Now, they are also, Dr. Kenneth is the first Black man to testify as a medical professional in a Supreme Court case, and he does that for the Brown v. Board of Education case. And when that case is overturned, Chief Justice Earl Warren's opinion says, in part, to separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect the hearts and minds in a way unlike ever to ever be undone, right? So we understand the importance of us getting a good idea of how this kind of behavior affects us, not just physically, but also mentally. And when it affects you mentally, it then goes and reverses and it attacks you, it affects you physically, right? So that we can understand why Jim Crow laws were so detrimental to access to healthcare for everybody, let's understand kind of what the two parts are, right? So there's de jure, which is before Brown. That's the way I look at it, right? So before the Brown v. Board of Education case, which said that schools needed to be desegregated, that started the process of desegregating other spaces. So that's the lawful enforcement of the separation of people. Over to this side, you see some of the laws that were in place in different states like Alabama and Mississippi, essentially enforcing the separation of people, right? Then we have de facto, which I like to call after Brown. And this is the quote unquote natural separation of groups because of racism. So Brown desegregates schools, and then all of a sudden you have white parents saying, I don't want my kid going to school with Black kids, so I'm going to move neighborhoods to this more white neighborhood. And so most of the times, historians call that white flight. So when white flight happens, then the resources that are available to that neighborhood diminish, which means crappier schools, crappier hospitals, crappier access to healthcare. A lot of times those neighborhoods then are turned into areas where chemical testing happens, or they're really close to some sort of chemical plant or whatever, right? Environmental racism. So we need to understand that even after Brown, there's still segregation, right? Even if it's not lawfully enforced, there's still segregation just because of the way society is. Now, this is where we get to the first of the personal touches, right? The young man that you saw in the first picture when I was introducing myself is Bob Zellner. Now, Bob was a part of SNCC, and SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they were some of the most radical young people during the height of the violence in the civil rights movement. I had the opportunity to meet both Bob Moses, who is standing here in his overalls, and Bob Zellner, which is why this thing about healthcare and equity touches me in a specific way, because I see what the lasting effects of trauma are every day in real life. So this is in 1964, where Bob Moses is going, he's recruiting folks to come down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, which took place in 1964. And Mississippi was considered one of the most racist and violent states. And the SNCC workers essentially said, if we can desegregate and get folks to be able to vote in Mississippi, we basically can do it everywhere, right? So they go and they recruit white students from the North, right? And I want folks to really understand that SNCC was an intergenerational, interracial project, okay? Intergenerational, interracial. So they go and they recruit a bunch of white folks and they get down to Mississippi and they start doing all of their things. Now, as you can see, this is Bob right here behind Julian Bond. This is Rita Schwerner. Her name now is Rita Bender. She was the wife of Mickey Schwerner, who was one of the 3 civil rights workers who was murdered in June of '64. So right before all of this starts, they have already lost 3 of their comrades, right? as you can see. I just want to make sure folks understand that I come by this information both academically and from somebody's experience. This is my Bob, right? This is my Bobo. I know what it's like for him to be out and about and to hear a car backfire and flinch, or he can't sleep, or his memory is off because of all the violence that he's faced. But this is what happened, right? And so from Bob is where I found out about what happens when the medical community understands what's going on and uses their skills and expertise to assist the movement. So Bob, one day we were telling stories. I think he was sitting on the recliner not too far from me in my office, and he had a bad dream, right? He had fallen asleep on the recliner. He had a bad dream, and I kind of talked him through it. And then he says, "Oh, that's the same thing that they used to do to for us when the Committee for Civil Rights would come around." So of course I asked him what was that, and it was literally a coalition of doctors and health workers who not only marched for equitable healthcare but also provided that healthcare, right? Now, a good number of civil rights veterans that they, as they came down for Freedom Summer, the psychologists started realizing like, yo, these guys are dealing with battle fatigue, the same kind of battle fatigue that you hear folks talk about with soldiers. Because again, you are watching your comrades die. You are in danger. Most of the time when folks would get ready to go out for a march, Bob said that he would have to write his last will and testament because there's no guarantee for you to come back, right? And so the psychiatrists providing care were like, yeah, you guys need rest and recreation. And that is how the civil rights workers were able to take breaks and not feel bad about taking breaks because we are here for longevity. We're not here for a flash in the pan. And so Bob was able to go and get his master's at Brandeis because they would force him to take breaks. And so during those breaks is when he would go and get his degree because they wanted him to do something that was outside of, you know, what he was dealing with on a daily basis by losing his friends. So because of organizations like the Medical Community for Human Rights or civil rights, which eventually became human rights, we get the passing of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which essentially says you guys got to desegregate. Like hospitals have to desegregate. And like Brown v. Board, not everybody wanted to desegregate right away. So what do people love in professional businesses? Money, right? When in doubt, hit the bottom line. And so that's what the government did. When they passed Medicare and Medicaid to 65, they said, in order for you guys to get pool this money, you guys need to desegregate. And immediately thousands of hospitals started to desegregate, right? But even though they started to segregate, the quality of healthcare still persisted. And then we are going to talk about some examples of how medical professionals and the community came together again to fill in some of those gaps. But before we do that, I just want to see if folks have some thoughts, right? So you can answer and share your questions, your responses in the chat, or you can unmute and let me know what you think. But what are some of your thoughts on the progress of access to healthcare when looking at our recap and Jim Crow's influence? If any one of these, touch your heart, you can say, oh, I feel like A, or I feel like B, or whatever the case may be. Or if you have your own kind of input, I would love to hear it as folks feel comfortable sharing. So I can check the chat. Okay, sweet. Okay, well, for me, I because I have such a personal connection to what healthcare was like in Jim Crow, it becomes really difficult to not want to improve any connection to healthcare that I have. So for me, that's kind of what I think about when I'm looking at the historical timeline of what we've talked about so far.
AJ, we do have one that came into the chat that says there is still a disparity, particularly in rural areas.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that Bob did was going into those rural areas and making sure that those folks had access to healthcare. And we're seeing what's happening now when folks are losing access to healthcare clinics in those rural areas. We're just making the situation worse, unfortunately.
Also, another comment says from Jacqueline, it's honestly very upsetting, and I feel like people don't realize how all this was not that long ago.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, I can open my chat. Absolutely. And that's why whenever possible, I try to use color photographs or I tell folks about Bob because he's here. He's still alive. I still hear these stories, but folks make it feel like it was a really, really long time ago. And it's like, no, this is within the lifetime of our parents and our grandparents. And we need to be aware of that. As we are thinking about these things and as you are engaging with the folks who are entering your space, right? If it's an older person who is a Black person in Seattle, most likely they have connections to the South. And whether that person has experienced it or not, it's in the orbit of their family, right? Yeah. Generational mistrust. Absolutely. Hearing it from our grandparents, right? And it turns into those like little sayings like, oh, we just don't do that, right? And so curiosity really becomes one of your greatest tools as you are engaging with your patients, because if you don't know what they're going through, if you don't know what their history is, hopefully these kinds of sessions can help you kind of be like, I wonder if this person maybe had a bad experience with the doctor before, and I can be the person to change that. Okay, so we're going to look at some organizations that have done some really awesome work when talking about how to fill in those healthcare gaps. The first is the birth of the physician's assistant, right? Again, during this time, we have the civil rights movement reaching its kind of pinnacle at that time. And then also we have the Vietnam War that's taking place. And so a lot of those corpsmen who were trained as medics came back and they had a lot of skills, but they didn't necessarily have the medical education that a traditional doctor would. And so the physician's assistant was born because it's like you have all these people with all these skill sets and we have a shortage of physicians. So let's figure out how to utilize that. Hold on. I see something in the chat that I want to make sure I Jasmine says my grandma was the first Black person to attend her school, so she went through the disparity of that. On the other side, my other grandpa thought Black people were a myth because he had never seen one before going to the military. Yeah. A lot of times, because of the ways in which we are segregated, whether we're aware of it or not, those types of moments happen, right? So as those students from the North were going into the South, some little kids had never seen white people before. Some ran, which is kind of fascinating to, put yourself in that position where you've never seen a white person, or everything that you know of white people has been told to you to keep you safe. And so you're like, oh, if I see a white person, I'm in danger. A lot of us have grandparents, uncles, aunties who have lived those experiences and sometimes don't want to talk about them, but they do, they do color the way that the person engages with the medical system. So from there, we also have the Freedom House Ambulance Service, which was a bunch of Black folks who decided that they wanted to make sure that their community had access to EMS. And so this was one of the first paramedic programs in the country, and it was started by, Black men who were trying to figure out how to take care of the community. I learned about this program because of Bob's wife. So Bob's wife, Pamela, is a doula and a midwife and has been doing that for 40 plus years. And so just in talking to her, I learned about all these different ways in which rural communities took care of themselves when they also did not have access to health care, right? And if you can notice, a lot of these spaces are intergenerational, interracial, because that's how you make it work, right? I really want to go to this space personally, but me and outside and nature, we don't get along too well. Anyway, so also we have the American Indian movement and all of the ways in
Uh,
which they were advocating for sorry, what was that?
Sorry to interrupt. Can you jump back to the previous slide? I just want to take notes on this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yay, somebody's taking notes. I personally would love to be a midwife, but I had to help deliver my cousin when I was 16 and it put me off. Maybe if I was a little older when I had to do that. Okay. Then we have the American Indian movement, and they were really trying to make sure that Natives' sovereignty and cultural grounded care was infused into the ways in which people, worked with the indigenous communities. And a lot of times that was not happening, right? Then probably one that most folks are aware of is ACT UP. ACT UP was very, very loud. ACT UP was very, very necessary. ACT UP was focusing on public education and policy pressure to try and ensure that folks actually start realizing that this epidemic is killing so many people, right? I am particularly sensitive to HIV/AIDS because my family in Kenya was hard hit with HIV/AIDS. And so I understand the stigma that comes around it. I understand how difficult it can be for somebody to just receive care. And so I have a soft spot for ACT UP. Now, the important thing to understand is within all of these community groups, there were medical professionals all in there, right? Because again, we have to work together. It doesn't work if it's only one group. Now, this is my favorite part, okay? This is where we turn the common struggle into the common goal. The gentleman that you are looking at here is, this right here is Bill Preacherman. This right here is Bobby Lee, but his full name is Robert E. Lee III, which I just think is fascinating. And then right here you have Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party. Now, this picture is really important because of what it represents and what it shows that is possible when people kind of put their differences aside and figure out how do we make everybody, get equitable access to what we need. I put this picture in here because what a juxtaposition, right? Free the Panthers and a Confederate flag. Those are kind of the two most diametrically opposed groups that you can think of. And so I want to talk about the Rainbow Coalition. The Rainbow Coalition was founded by Fred Hampton, who was part of the Black Panther Party, and essentially it united Black, white, and Latinx working class groups of people to fight for the things that they were all dealing with in their communities, right? So you have the Young Patriots, which was made up of poor migrants from Appalachia, and they learned from the Panthers how to provide free meals, literacy programs, and health and housing advocacy in their neighborhoods. Then we have the Young Lords, which were a Puerto Rican liberation group that ran lead poisoning campaigns, TB campaigns in their communities, garbage and sanitation efforts, and even occupied hospitals such as the Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx in the 1970s as a way to call and demand for better care facilities. So the Rainbow Coalition essentially laid the groundwork for today's clinics and community healthcare centers, and yet not a lot of people would actually know that, right? One of the most important things that we need to understand in working together with folks who have different experiences than us is the goal is not to become best friends, right? The goal is to achieve whatever our objective is. It's not to be best friends. If you can function with a sense of respect for what that other person is trying to accomplish, it makes everything so much easier, right? Could you imagine a Black Panther working with somebody who's rocking a Confederate flag, right? Even that sentence doesn't make sense. But because the Young Patriots understood that their children were not getting access to clean water, the Young Lords understood that their children were being exposed to TB, and the Black Panther Party was like, how do we take care and feed our communities? And that's what happened. And that's how we got to the Rainbow Coalition. Hold on, there's a question in here. Courtney. Former doula, I love Ina May and the fact that the farm and their midwifery school are highlighted. Yeah, they absolutely did. I personally have a very soft spot for her, especially because of the work that Miss Pam had done and because of the work that my mom does. And I'll get into that in a second. Okay. Now, this is a 2-minute video that's going to give us an idea of the Panther Party's programs. I remember when I was first learning about the Black Panther Party, I was told, in various ways that the Panther Party was a violent party. They showed all the pictures of them with guns and stuff like that. And so you start to kind of get afraid. That was around middle school. When I got to high school, one of the security guards at my high school was Michael Dixon, the brother of Aaron Dixon, who started the Black Panther Party up here in Seattle. Now, my Mr. Dixon was not part of the Panther Party because he was a little too wild, but it was really awesome at lunchtime hearing the stories of what his brothers did. And that's when I really started to understand, like, whoa, what I learned about the Panthers is not what the Panthers actually do. And the Panthers and their healthcare program has an interesting connection to Seattle, but this is a quick 2-minute video just for folks to understand kind of what the Panther Party was outside of what we are told by, general media.
Talk about the impact of racism and the healthcare system. I mean, there is a long history of medical discrimination. We can think of the history that involves Black bodies being used as guinea pigs, Black women and women of color going to the doctors and getting illegally sterilized. And so this has caused a lot of mistrust. And then your zip code matters. Black communities that are in disenfranchised area, we have a history of not being protected. And so part of the history of medical discrimination is what the Panthers were trying to fight. Everything from first aid, they had a free ambulance program, they had sickle cell anemia testing, they had gynecological exams, optometry services, physical exams. There are tons of services that the Black Panther Party offered when we talk about healthcare.
We designed a program to go door to door and really test for diseases like tuberculosis, anemia, diabetes. These are preventable diseases. We'd go in and there would be an elderly person in some apartment who really needed to see a doctor, but they were afraid to go to the doctor. And that's how we would be able to refer them to a place where they would be seen and be helped before the illness, whatever illness they have, got too difficult for them.
They was in the community educating, offering tools to medically empower the Black community. And much of that understanding of the Black Panther Party has been written out of the public perceptions of the organization.
I don't know about you guys, but it was fascinating finding out how much the Panthers actually did, right? And again, making the connection back to Seattle. Seattle has the only location of one of the Panthers' free medical clinics that is still standing to this day, and that's the Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center. In addition to other community clinics like Country Doctor and stuff like that, Country Doctor has a very, very, very close place to my heart, because when my mom and I were starting off in Seattle, like we would go to Country Doctor to get our healthcare needs, right? And so one of the things that I really love also about the Panther story is this gentleman, Dr. John Green, right? I have not been able to find a picture of Dr. John Green. I have an inquiry out to the archives department at UW just because I want to see what he looks like. But Dr. John Green was crucial in making sure that the Carolyn Downs Clinic actually happened, right? So the Mr. Dixon and his brothers and the other Panther members would pull a U-Haul truck to the back of UW, and Dr. Green would just give them supplies. From gurneys to, now I don't know how Dr. Green got his hands on this, so, leave that part. I'm going to figure that part out and let you guys know. But he used whatever connections he had to ensure that the Panther Party had what they need to take care of the community. And that is what I hope you all are getting out of this, is you are important, right? You are capable of making change just by being you and using the kind of access that you have to ensure that the person is getting access to good healthcare, right? Kind healthcare. As you can see from that video, there were older folks who are afraid to go to the hospital, right? It's like me and the dentist. I have a great dentist, by the way, right now. She understands my fear, but I am going to be brave enough to go to the dentist. I need the dentist also to meet me there, right? If the dentist is rude, it's just going to enforce the idea that I don't want to go to the dentist. So I really hope that these are examples on ways in which the community can work with the medical community, because you guys are important. This is you, right? You are the reason. This is why I said you guys are Jedis, right? Because this is your mission, right? Every single person in the Jedi Council is important. It's not just Yoda or Mace Windu, who's my favorite. I have a tattoo of Mace Windu's lightsaber on my finger. But I love this quote from a book called Shatterpoint. For those into Star Wars, this is just deep Star Wars lore, so don't worry about it. And it's about a point where Mace Windu was trying to resolve a problem, but he kept doing the same thing over and over. So as he's meditating, he's like, what would Yoda say to me? And Yoda would say, if no mistake you have made, losing you are. A different game you should play. So essentially, perfection is not the goal. Quality care is, right? You cannot be perfect. It doesn't work. Also, you cannot put yourself in a box to where you tried that one thing, it didn't work. Okay, so we're not going to do it again. That's not how life works. In the position that you have right now, right? You messed up something, or you didn't, you failed a test, or whatever the case may be, but there were stumbling blocks to you getting to where you are. And a lot of times it's just picking yourself off, dusting off, and trying again. And that's what I hope folks can do. But also, your experience matters, right? So this is a video from PBS NewsHour. If you cannot tell, I love me some PBS, very much so. But this is a video talking about a study that is focusing on healthcare professionals and what you guys think about what's going on. So we're going to play this video and then we're going to kind of get to our wrap up and questions.
In this study from the Commonwealth Fund, nearly half of healthcare workers in the U.S. say racism against patients is a major problem, and equal numbers report that they have personally witnessed discrimination against patients in their workplace. Employees at facilities that mostly serve Black or Latino patients reported higher instances of discrimination. To expand on the study's findings and why it matters, I'm joined by one of its co-authors. Dr. Lori Zephyrin is Senior Vice President for Advancing Health Equity at the Commonwealth Fund. Dr. Zephyrin, so good to have you on the NewsHour. So half of healthcare workers say racism is a major problem. They've seen it in their own workplaces. I'm curious why you chose to look at this issue from this perspective.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. You know, previous research really tells us that racism and discrimination impact healthcare outcomes, especially for people of color. This study goes a step further, really spotlighting the voice of healthcare workers who witness racism and discrimination and also experience it themselves. In terms of why healthcare workers, understanding what healthcare workers are experiencing, and what they need from their employers and colleagues to address discrimination is really critical to successful and sustainable change. Healthcare workers are a key part of the healthcare system, and they can be a part of the solution. You know, we do know that the perspective of patients and providers are incredibly important, but for this study, we decided to focus on healthcare workers because they're on the ground. You know, they impact the day-to-day care of people, and healthcare workers are living and breathing in the healthcare system every day. They really experience the realities of what it is to provide healthcare firsthand.
One of the more striking disparities in this was the perspective of Black healthcare workers. And I'm going to put this graphic up. While half of all healthcare workers said doctors are more accepting of white patients advocating for themselves compared to Black patients, it was 70% of Black workers who said this. I mean, that kind of perspective just has to really leap out at you.
Yeah, it does. It does leap out at you. You know, where you come from is important. Diverse experiences are incredibly important. You know, the data are clear just in general on the importance of a culturally diverse workforce. It has a really profound impact on the healthcare system, on the patients served. I'm sure you've seen the data about diverse workforce. It can address cultural needs, language needs, improve communication, improve patient satisfaction. And there also may be more awareness of the impacts of discrimination and bias because of lived experience.
There was also similar disparities when it came to language differences, with over 70% of Latino workers saying that non-English speaking patients just don't get the same kind of care as English speaking patients. Do these disparities, do you believe, actually impact patient outcomes?
There are data that support the linkage between discrimination and impact on quality of care. So we do know that there are significant disparities and inequities in outcomes, whether we're talking about maternal mortality and the crisis we're experiencing in this country, or we're talking about inequities in life expectancy. We do know that where you live, work, play impacts your outcomes, right? And there's impacts of discrimination and racism on the social determinants of health. So we certainly have data that support this linkage. And to your point earlier, for people that have lived experience, whether it's race, ethnicity, language, other aspects of culture, there just may be more of a understanding, more of a recognition, more of a sensitivity to witnessing and discrimination within the healthcare system.
Okay. So a lot of times we wonder, like, what can I do? Me as a single individual person, what can I do? As somebody who used to be a medical receptionist for the kidney centers, I definitely understand what you mean by what can I do. And a lot of times it starts with a simple step. Just be kind and be curious. Flip the perspective, right? You may be having a bad day, but they don't know that. They may be having a bad day and you don't know that. And a lot of times when those wires get crossed, things can blow up, but be curious, right? I want to kind of do this instant noodle with you, and I added one more slide last minute because I finally got permission from my mom. But again, I said this was going to be a personal presentation, and I do want folks to understand how personal healthcare equity is to me because, again, of the connection that I have with people in my community. But before we do that, I just want to know which reflection best aligns with how you personally, within your position at Proliant, see the way intersectional collaboration and health equity could work. This is not supposed to be we're getting the right answer. I just want to see kind of where folks are at as far as how they're feeling around intersectional collaboration, if possible. And as you're thinking about it and maybe putting stuff in the chat, I will say this has been probably my most fun research series situation. I'm pretty sure most of my best friends are tired of hearing me talk about health equity, but I have thoroughly enjoyed doing this research. I think you guys are doing something amazing and just being curious about the ways that things can work and the way that things can be different. And I absolutely love that. And I agree with Jacqueline, it is all of the above. Absolutely. Absolutely all of the above.
Yeah, AJ, I would have to say that for me, B really stands out, that making a change sometimes requires risk, putting yourself out there, much like us choosing to run your series this year, right? It's a lot, it's a heavy topic that you cover. It's a lot of work that goes into it, and all of us understanding that we're learning new history. It's not new, but for a lot of us, we haven't learned this before. I'll go back to the Black Panther Party. I remember seeing the pictures with the guns and, how the government shut them down. And I never heard about all of the good that, the Black Panther Party did. And, but the solidarity and really putting yourself out there to speak up. And again, just going back to kindness. I know a lot of you will see my emails. It always says kind regards. And I believe I'm a heavy hitter when it comes to just being kind, just smiling at somebody on the street, smiling at the person standing on the corner who maybe isn't doing as well as you, right? That kindness can go a long ways.
I see a hand up from Jasmine.
Yeah, I figured this time I'd take myself off mute.
All good.
I would say for me, D, just because, you don't always think about, we come into the healthcare every day and we want to provide excellent customer service to every single person, but you don't even think about the people that are fearful of coming in because of the things that they've witnessed in the past or that they might have known from going to doctors. And so that's something that kind of just changes my mindset a little bit, just because, it's one thing to provide excellent customer service, but it's another thing when you have somebody that's terrified to come in, especially being in orthopedics, they might need surgery, they might not trust the doctors to cut into their body because of X, Y, and Z. And so just taking that extra approach and really going above and beyond for the patients.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that. As somebody who is scared of doctors personally, I've been with my doctor for quite some time, so she knows how ridiculous I am when it's time for me to get like a flu shot or something. But being comfortable enough to be a weenie in front of my doctor has me going back, right? Then I'm not so scared of the things that I need to do for my health because I know she's going to allow me to complain the whole time, right? And because of word of mouth and because of the safety that I feel, I told my best friend, and now my best friend also goes to that doctor. We all go to the same eye care person. We all go to the same dentist because once we understand that, oh, this person is going to see us for who we are, great. Now I want to have other people also feel like this. And a lot of times it's not exactly about the race of the person. A lot of times it is about how that person makes you feel, right? It really is that simple. So I see April has said grassroots collaborative advocacy is so helpful in creating opportunities for change. I'm so glad you said that because it aligns with this next one. So again, I want you to listen and see what kind of emotions come up as we do our kind of final close. This could be your patient, right?
She's had to overcome her share of challenges. In addition to learning to navigate a new country and culture, she left an unhealthy marriage and was homeless for a few months when she first moved to Seattle. She soon found her way, landing a job with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Using her expertise and connection, she organized an HIV/AIDS fact-finding trip for former President Jimmy Carter and Bill Gates Sr., While on that trip, she realized she wanted a seat at the table to discuss the challenges that Africans face, and she knew that only an education would help earn her that seat. She enrolled at Seattle Central College in 2002 and eventually earned an associate degree. She found the instructors warm, welcoming, and supportive, and the corridors filled with people from all over the world, people filled with hopes and dreams for a better future. She transferred to the University of Washington, earned a degree in public health, and then a Master of Public Administration. Along the way, she was named a Harry Truman Foundation Scholar, a tremendous honor that is given just to one student in each state per year.
Pretty awesome, huh? He's talking about my mom. This was the 2015 commencement for Seattle Central, and she was the alumni of the year. And this is what my mom has built, right? This is what my legacy is in Kenya. It started off as a 2-story building, and in here we've now added the health clinic. So as you can see, health is extremely important because most of these students are HIV/AIDS positive, and a good portion of them are also complete orphans. And so when I talk about how much pride I have in my mom, it's not just because just on paper my mom is a superhero, but it is the personal touch that she puts into everything, which is why all of this is so important to me. And so I want you to hear her voice, right? I want you to hear her voice and see how goofy this lady is, and think about what comes up for you if she was to walk up to you at the front desk, or she was your patient and you heard her accent. This is 15 seconds. My mom was getting ready to leave and go to Kenya. I'm sad and she's not.
Take the power of positive thinking. Did you notice that my water bottle is matching my top on my trousers?
She doesn't sound like me, right? My mom has a beautiful accent, and she's had that accent for we got to the States when I was 7. I will say I'm almost 40. So I'm pretty pumped about that personally. But when I go to doctor's appointments with my mom, it's because as soon as somebody hears her accent, they already have made a decision that she is not going to get the same kind of care that I would get if I was to walk in and do my check-in, right? So when you have folks who come in that, English is their second language or third, my mom speaks 7, but, overachiever, right? Do not assume. This is where, again, curiosity is your greatest tool, right? I'd like to say that curiosity is your lightsaber, right? If you are a Jedi, that is your greatest tool. That is the thing that is custom to you. So just wonder, right? That person may be having a bad day, but that does not mean that you are a bad healthcare worker. A lot of times, kindness and curiosity will assist us in figuring out how we can best move forward. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say thank you for letting me share all of my nerdy knowledge on healthcare equity, and I would love to answer some questions, or if folks have thoughts that they would like to share, please feel free. I'll pass it back to Belinda and Tyler.
Yeah, great. I know we have a couple more comments in the chat, but at this time, does anyone have any questions for HA before we wrap up, or comments? Thank you so much for sharing your mom with us. I love it.
Yeah, she is the bee's knees.
Yeah. So we do have Lucy saying your mama sounds intelligent, 7 languages. Wow, she is smart. Sarah saying thank you. Is a very, very wholesome. Favorite part was the ending. OSS, are there any resources online that we can find more in?
Absolutely. One of my favorite things to do is also to offer resources. So for each of the sessions, there is a specific resource list for folks to be able to dig in deeper. And so one will be made available for this session as well. I'll be sending it to Tyler, after this, and then it'll be accessible to you folks as you choose.
Awesome. Kay says, I think having an interpreter, they're coming in quick, available for phone calls would help a lot of our patients between appointments. Again, people just want info. Great presentation. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for highlighting the power of curiosity. Thank you. I'm reading briefly Perfectly Human by Alua Arthur. The author talks pretty poetically about disparity in healthcare, end-of-life care. Ooh, that's a good one, end-of-life care, and addressing differences in personal belief systems eloquently.
Yeah, I used to work at an assisted living facility. I personally just have a soft spot for my elders. In my tribe, I'm from the Luo tribe. We say when you lose an elder, you lose a library. My grandfather was my absolute favorite person. And we revere getting older, right? Getting older is not something scary. It's like you are a day wiser than you were the day before. And after working in an assisted living facility, I realized how little this country respects elders. And that really just, it peeves me, right? You know, Bob is one of my favorite people in the entire world. He's battling cancer right now, in addition to all the other ailments that he has. And I can't imagine somebody not treating him the way he deserves to be treated, not because of who he is and what he's done, but simply because he has survived life on this planet for as long as he has, right? My favorite older folks at the assisted living facility were the grumpy, crotchety ones, because a lot of times you had to earn that trust, right? And so, again, regardless of who you are engaging with, regardless of who you are interacting with, if you can just lead with kindness, right? We don't know what that person is going through. They don't know what you're going through. And a lot of times, if you are, as the first step, are kind, it'll shift the interaction for that person. And that's why I'm like, that is really like the first step. Yes, policy will come because you enter those policy meeting with that kindness front of mind, right? So it's like policy will come, but let's pause and start at kindness. I see, I think April unmuted.
I did, AJ, and I'm not exactly sure how to ask this question. I've worked in the domestic and sexual violence space for a good many years in Pierce County, and we've said for many, many years that we can't solve the problem without men, without involving men. So, you know, and there are lots of ways that we try to get men involved. So, as a white person coming into a space to try to be helpful to people of color, do you have recommendations for how to do that? Like, we can't solve the problem without all of us, people of color and white people, coming together to address all of the deeply systemic issues that impact people of color. So where can I, as a white person, help?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question. And also I really like giving kind of practical advice of something that you can do. So this is great. I'm gonna bring up Bob again. So Bob's family was in the Klan, right? Like his grandfather was a Grand Wizard, his dad was in the Klan, and Bob becomes the first white field secretary for SNCC. And one of the things that Bob said, and I've asked him numerous times, like, how did you as a white person raised in the environment that you were raised in to think that you are superior in every way, shape, or form, how do you then end up working for SNCC? And he said, you have to understand that you need to humble yourself, right? A lot of times when white folks come in who have a lot of education, experience, money, whatever the case may be, you come in thinking that you are going to solve the problem. And that's not what we want you to do, right? I also understand this on an international space because my mom has a nonprofit, right? Literally, she's raising funds to help these folks on the ground who are that's family. That is our ancestral village, right? So then when we get white folks who come in and tell us how to do something in a village that they have never been to before, it's just like, what are you doing? Right? A lot of those times you have to ask yourself, am I doing this to get a cookie and a pat on the back and a gold star? Or am I doing this because I believe in the mission, right? Going back to, we don't need to be best friends. I don't actually have to know what you did over the weekend, right? What I do need to know is that when you and I are in this space, regardless of if your idea gets picked or not, we are for progress. And I think at times that is the part that gets difficult. Also, you have to be okay being corrected, right? You have lived life with a very particular reality, right? And that reality is not bad, right? It's not your fault that you live in a fairly white city and you are a white woman. That is just your reality. Because of that reality, you and I have different ways of seeing the world, right? Just simply like that. And so if I say I experience XYZ and the response is, well, no, then it's like, okay, cool. You've already dismissed my experience and you don't even know what my experience is like because you've never had this experience, right? So I think if we can get those kind of building blocks in, or learning to apologize, and it's like, you know what, you're right. I put my foot in my mouth. I apologize. That's my bad. And then come back to the table. Because a lot of times we'll say, oh my God, I messed up, and then run away and we don't come back. So if we can do those few points, right? If we can get practice in those few points, everything else starts to be able to work out. And that's what I've learned from Bob. You have to be humble enough to not want to lead. We need foot soldiers, essentially, right? Dr. John Green, he's not in any pictures that I've found publicly of the Black Panther Party in Seattle, but yet it was not possible for them to do what they did without his support and assistance. You know, at those sickle cell clinics, there were white folks, but they took direction from Black people. And I think that's probably the first step in those spaces.
Thank you, AJ.
Absolutely. Jill said, that's great. I think a lot of workers are focused on working fast and efficient as possible. So when we come across a patient that's older or someone with an accent or language barrier, we see it as something that's holding us back from the task and taking too much time. Yep, that's fair. Instead of treating them as they are the most important person, giving them extra moment. Yeah, that's fair. Now, look, as someone who has a parent who has a great relationship with all her medical professionals, like, yeah, sometimes I'm like, Ma, speed it up, like for real, please. But that's also what keeps her going back to that doctor, right? So it's a balance. I'm not going to tell you guys to spend, 45 minutes with the patient because I'm sure that's impossible. But the way that you engage with that patient does dictate if that patient comes back to you. And again, that's why I'm always like, kindness is really just the easiest first step. Oh, thank you, Courtney.
Does anyone else have a question or comment? We are coming up on time and we're going to need to wrap up. And thank you, AJ. We could talk to you all day.
Do we want to share the QR code, Linda?
Yes, for sure.
I can do that.
We're gonna have Tyler close us out. We do have an ask from everybody to help us prepare for our final session on health equity this year. I would like to share that we will have AJ join us again, as well as Dr. Charlie Peterson, and they are going to be tying all of this together for us and answering our questions for a meaningful conversation. That is going to happen in October, date soon to come. Got to get with Dr. Peterson and his schedule and AJ and her schedule. But it's going to be a lot of fun in wrapping this series up. So Tyler, can you explain what we're doing to gather this?
Absolutely. So as Belinda mentioned, we're trying to gather your guys' questions from the series so far. These questions will help us guide the last remaining session content. So all we need to do here is have you scan the QR code. And if you have any questions related to the healthcare education series so far, anything that you're curious on related that may not have been brought up, if you could please scan the QR code and write down your question or questions. Those will be collected 100% anonymously, and we will then send them collectively over to AJ and Dr. Peterson to help guide their last session and answer those questions. If you don't have time to scan and fill this out today, no worries at all. We'll be sending out a follow-up email that will include the QR code and a link for everybody. That way, if you were on this call and went through the other series or just want to ask questions, it will be available to everybody. But if you have a few minutes to do it now before you forget about it, life happens, you're busy, the sooner you do it, the more meaningful and impactful our remaining session can be. So we appreciate your time and filling this out and asking your questions. Again, 100% anonymous, and they'll just be used to guide our last session. But thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, AJ, for all your hard work and all that you've shared with us thus far. And Belinda, as always, thank you for being such a wonderful co-host.